The air in the Wolfschanze, the wolf's lair, always carried a faint metallic tang, a mixture of damp concrete, ozone from the radio sets, and the cheap, acrid tobacco favored by the mid-level adjutants. In December 1941, it also carried the chill of a Russian winter that had begun to bite through the thermal layers of men who had been promised a summer victory. Adolf Hitler sat at a heavy oak table, his eyes tracing the red lines on a map that represented Army Group Center. To his west, across an ocean he had never seen and barely understood, a naval base called Pearl Harbor was still smoldering. To his east, the German Wehrmacht was freezing in its summer tunics, the oil in their Mausers thickening into a useless sludge. Most historians look at the declaration of war against the United States on December 11th as a fit of pique or an ideological reflex. In reality, it was the final movement of a catastrophic mathematical error, a failure of ledger books and logistics that began long before the 1st Panzer crossed the Bug River. If you had walked through the Krupp Steel Works in Essen in early 1941, you would have seen a miracle of synchronization. The rhythmic hammer fall of the presses, the glowing orange rivers of molten iron, the precision of the lathes turning out the barrels for the 80 mm flak guns. On paper, Germany was the master of Europe, but beneath the surface of this industrial triumph was a hollow core. German war production was an artisanal nightmare masquerading as a modern economy. They weren't building tanks, they were crafting them. A Tiger tank required 300,000 man-hours to produce, each one a bespoke beast of torsion bars and overlapping wheels that were a mechanic's special hell in the freezing mud of the East. Across the Atlantic, the Americans were thinking in different units entirely. They weren't thinking in man-hours, they were thinking in minutes. The great miscalculation wasn't just about how many tanks the U.S. could build, but how those tanks, and the trucks, the canned meat, and the boots would find their way into the hands of a Russian peasant soldier, who, by all German calculations, should have been dead by October. Hitler's worldview was built on the concept of Lebensraum, a sprawling land empire that would make Germany blockade-proof. He viewed the United States through the lens of 1917, a disorganized, racially mongrelized society that would take years to mobilize. He saw a nation of jazz and skyscrapers, not a nation of assembly lines that could pivot from sewing machines to submachine guns in a single fiscal quarter. He believed that by declaring war, he was merely acknowledging a reality, that Roosevelt was already his enemy. What he failed to see was that he was handing Stalin a life jacket made of American steel. Logistics is a dull word for a terrifying reality. It is the sound of a train whistle in the middle of the night, on a track that stretches from Vladivostok to Moscow. By 1942, the Red Army was losing men at a rate that would have collapsed any other civilization in history. They lost their primary, coal regions, their breadbasket in the Ukraine, and their largest factories in the West. The German General Staff looked at their slide rules and concluded that the Soviet Union was a corpse that had forgotten to fall over. They were right, mathematically, if the Soviet Union had been forced to rely on its own shattered infrastructure. But the mathematical error was the failure to account for the Studebaker. The Studebaker US-6 2.5-ton truck did more to save Moscow than the T-34 tank ever did. It didn't have the glamour of a fighter plane or the terror of a heavy gun, but it had a high-range gearbox and a hunger for rough terrain. While the German infantry were still literally hitching their fortunes to horses, thousands of them dying of exhaustion and being eaten by starving Lancer, the Red Army was being motorized by Detroit. By the time the Battle of Kursk rolled around, the Soviet supply lines were humming with American grease and American fuel. Hitler had declared war on the one power that could bridge the gap between Stalin's infinite manpower and his zeroed-out industrial capacity. In the high-ceilinged offices of the Reich Ministry of Armaments, Fritz Todt, and later Albert Speer, knew the numbers were turning sour. They saw the reports from the OKW. They saw that for every German aircraft produced, the Allies were churning out 5. They saw the tonnage of the Liberty ships, ugly, slab-sided vessels that looked like floating bathtubs but could be built in days. One ship, the Robert E. Peary, was assembled in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. To a German engineer, trained in the tradition of meticulous craftsmanship, this was vulgar. To a German general, it was a death sentence. Hitler dismissed these reports as American bluff. He had a mystical faith in the will, a belief that the superior spirit of the Aryan soldier could overcome the material weight of 1,000 Sherman tanks. It was a romantic's delusion applied to a machinist's war. The grit of this reality was felt most sharply by the German mechanic in the WWII field. Imagine him in 1943, somewhere near the Don River. His knuckles are split from the cold, his skin stained with used diesel, and the gray-black soot of a warming fire. He is trying to repair a Panzer IV using parts salvaged from a knocked-out wreck. Because the spare parts are sitting in a warehouse in Magdeburg, 2,000 miles away, on a rail line that is being shredded by partisans. He looks up and sees a swarm of Il-2 Sturmovix overhead, planes that shouldn't exist according to the production estimates he heard on the radio. He doesn't know about the Lend-Lease aluminum from Alcoa that made those wings possible, or the high-octane American fuel in their tanks. He only knows that the mathematics of the war has moved beyond his reach. Stalin, a man of cold, paranoid calculations, understood the math perfectly. He famously toasted the American industry at the Tehran conference, noting that without the machines provided under Lend-Lease, the war would have been lost. It wasn't just the flashy stuff. It was the 15 million pairs of boots. It was the tushanka, the canned pork that fed the Red Army when the Ukrainian grain was gone. It was the 2,000 locomotives and 11,000 rail cars. Hitler had assumed that, by declaring war on America, he would unleash Japan to tie down the U.S. in the Pacific. Instead, he allowed Roosevelt to implement Germany first, a strategic pivot that turned the United States into a giant conveyor belt, dumping the entire weight of the Western Hemisphere onto the German Eastern Front. The sheer arrogance of the German leadership regarding American capacity is almost breathtaking in retrospect. Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, once told the Italian Count Ciano that the Americans couldn't even build a decent airplane, only refrigerators and radios. This dismissiveness wasn't just propaganda, it was a genuine cognitive bias. They believed that because the U.S. was a democracy, it was soft. Because it was capitalist, it was fractured. They didn't understand the terrifying, monolithic power of a mobilized market economy. They didn't understand that a Ford plant in Michigan could outproduce the entire industrial output of the Ruhr Valley once the profit motive was replaced by the survival motive. As the war progressed, the error compounded. Every American bomb that fell on a German ball-bearing factory was a subtraction from the German total. Every American truck that arrived in Murmansk was an addition to the Soviet total. The gap grew from a crack into a chasm. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was a ghost of itself, a collection of static divisions and understrength panzer units that existed mostly on the maps in the bunker. The soldiers on the ground knew. They saw the skies belong to the P-47s and P-51s. They heard the endless thunder of Soviet artillery, much of it towed by American trucks. The mathematical saving of Stalin was visible in every kilometer the Red Army advanced westward. The silence that fell over the Wolfschanze in those final months was the silence of a man who had run out of numbers. Hitler's maps were now meaningless. The red lines had been erased by the reality of a world that could produce more than he could destroy. He had gambled on a short war because he knew he couldn't win a long one. Yet he had personally invited the world's greatest marathon runner into the race. The declaration of war against the USA remains the single greatest unforced error in military history. It wasn't a tactical mistake. It was a total divorce from the physical reality of the planet's resources. In the end, the war wasn't won by a single genius stroke of a general's pen. It was won by the relentless grinding hum of the American Midwest, by the women in overalls in Seattle, and by the dock workers in New Orleans. It was won by the ledger books that Hitler refused to believe in. As the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag, it was being held by soldiers who had likely reached Berlin on American tires, eating American rations and wearing American wool. The math had finally balanced itself out, and the cost was the total annihilation of the regime that had failed to count the cost. The smoke over Berlin was the final exhale of a nation that had tried to fight the future with the tools of the U, passed and lost to the simple, brutal weight of the numbers.